Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Nearly eradicated so their feathers could adorn fancy hats, the great egret is now thriving. We discuss what we can learn from that environmental success story on today's First Coast Connect. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ann Schindler. Later in the program, a new nonprofit offers help for damaged and dilapidated homes. And an annual festival celebrates women through art and dance. We'll tell you what the Women Arts Exchange has in store. But first, in a world of doom scrolling and catastrophes, humans are still capable of making remarkable changes. Here to remind us of the power of making progress for good is Dr. Nancy Knowlton. She is a renowned marine scientist, conservation biologist, and author of Citizens of the Sea, Wondrous Creatures from the Census of Marine Life. And she joins us now via video. Dr. Knowlton, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks very much for having me.
So
Please call me Nancy.
Nancy, thanks. You recently visited the First Coast and you spoke at the University of Florida's Whitney Laboratory for Marine Bioscience, just south of St. Augustine. And your topic was environmental bright spots. Why did you want to talk about those?
I wanted to talk about bright spots because so much of the environmental messaging has been about all the failures and the catastrophes that have occurred and or might occur in the future. And while it's really important to understand the threats that the environment faces, it's also very, very important to understand what we've actually accomplished and what we might accomplish in the future if we take action. If we essentially immerse ourselves in doom and gloom, it tends to lead to apathy rather than action.
So for those of us who want to see some of the visuals that we'll be discussing with Dr. Knowlton, you can check out our live stream now on Facebook, YouTube, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to watch. Nancy, you've been a coral researcher since the 1970s. We've got an image that shows you from the early days doing your scuba work in Discovery Bay, Jamaica, and then a current photo. In the middle is a graph that's a little upsetting. It shows the percent of live coral in sharp decline. So you are not in any way ignorant of the challenges, or in fact, it's been for a long time, it was central to your messaging on the lecture circuit.
That's right. I mean, I did watch the decline of these beautiful reefs in Jamaica and elsewhere around the world over the course of my career. When I went to Jamaica at first, it was covered with live staghorn coral and elkhorn coral, corals that also used to be common on the Florida reefs. And within about 10 years, they were essentially gone. And what used to be about 60 or 70% live coral on the bottom became less than 10%. So very, very early on in my career, I saw how fragile these ecosystems were that I had, as a grad student, had thought would be there around there forever. And as a result, I spent literally decades giving talks around the United States and internationally about the plight of coral reefs and, for that matter, other ocean habitats. My husband, who's also a marine scientist, did the same. We were sometimes called Drs. Doom and Gloom on the lecture circuit. But eventually, really because I started teaching graduate students at the University of California at San Diego at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, I had created this program with others to focus on solutions, and yet I felt we were only teaching about the bad news, and that we were training our students to write ever more refined obituaries of nature. And it was really interacting with this new generation of students made me realize I can't just talk about all the bad things as a motivator to try to do something about it. And then as I started to try to talk about the good things, I realized that many of my colleagues weren't even aware of the good things that were happening. So that really gave me even more determination to really start to shine a light on the bright spots so that we could learn from them and be inspired by them.
And you've said that if you're just focusing on bad news without solutions, that can just lead to apathy and instead of action. And you offered an example of the framing of facts and how important that can be in terms of how we consider the state of things. Can you talk a little bit about child death statistics and why that is an important metric to look at when you're trying to consider environmental issues?
Yeah, the framing comes from a guy named Max Roser who started this program called Our World in Data, which is actually a wonderful website for anyone who wants to actually get hard numbers about what's going on. And he talks about the importance of keeping three different ways of thinking about the world in your mind simultaneously. Now, we're really good at focusing on the woes of the present, if you will, and we sort of see this in the context of doom scrolling. And one example of that in using childhood mortality as a way of illustrating this point is to concentrate on the fact that globally about 4.4% of children die before adulthood, which is a terrible statistic. And it's important to recognize that statistic. But at the same time, we can't forget that there's already been a lot of progress. And before modern medicine, for example, 50% of children died before adulthood. So 4.4% is a much better statistic than 50%. And then there's a third way of thinking about it, which is that even though 4.4% of children die before adulthood on average in the world, there are bright spots, and including in Europe, where only 0.47% of children die before adulthood. And so that gives us a kind of a goal to aim for. In other words, we've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot more we still could do. And we need to keep all those different ways of thinking about the world in our heads simultaneously in order to really take action.
And so at the top of the show, I mentioned egrets, the great egret. I'm interested if you could just recount for us what happened to them. This is a species whose name in French actually means feathers, and they were really plundered for a while for their feathers. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, in the late 19th century, it became very fashionable for women to wear hats that were covered with feathers, and actually also military gear sometimes had feathers in it, a lot of different sort of stylish uses for these feathers. The problem was that this huge fad for feathers, if you will, led to incredible slaughters. It's been estimated that maybe as many as 5 million birds were slaughtered annually. And there's one story of a guy who claimed to have killed 40,000 terns just in a single day. And they would go to breeding colonies where the birds were had full plumage, but they'd wait until the babies were born. So the parents were very reluctant to leave the nestlings and literally pull the adults from the nest, sometimes just pull their feathers out with the birds living. And then, of course, the babies were doomed as well as the parents. And so this led to enormous declines in many of these shorebirds that have these beautiful feathers when they're breathing. So as a result of this, and both the decline and the barbarity of the practice, 2 women in England and separately 2 women in the United States got together and organized people to boycott hats with feathers. And this led to a mass movement in the United States that ultimately led to the creation of the Audubon Society and ultimately to federal action to prohibit the trade in these feathers. And as a result, you can see these birds really commonly. When I was visiting, I actually went to the alligator farm, and they were just beginning to court. And I'm sure anywhere along the shoreline now where your viewers and listeners are, they can take a look and see these extraordinarily beautiful birds. They're now, again, common thanks to the steps that we took to protect them.
And you mentioned the alligator farm. They have a beautiful rookery there. People don't always think of birds with that location, but the first national wildlife refuge was also an outgrowth of this protest that these women put together. It led to the creation of Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge in the early 1900s by the president then, Teddy Roosevelt. The first of its kind, and really also instrumental in helping this species have a place to rebound in safety.
Exactly. And Florida has many things to be proud of in terms of its environmental record. And this is certainly one of them. I was actually going to mention it before you mentioned it. So yes, it's the first national wildlife refuge to protect breeding birds established in Florida and Pelican Island. It's a wonderful part of that story of success.
You mentioned other successes, and pelicans. Tell us about the brown pelican, because that's also a pretty remarkable story of near extinction.
Yes, the brown pelican was actually also suffered from this plumage problem, but it did recover. But then it faced a new threat, and that was the widespread use of the pesticide DDT. As I'm sure some of your viewers and listeners know, the problem with DDT is that it accumulates up the food chain. And so pelicans, because they are sort of high on the food chain, they eat fish rather than, say, plants. They accumulated DDT in their tissues. And in birds, it has a particularly devastating impact because it makes the shells of their eggs very, very thin and leads to mass breeding failure, because when the birds sit on the eggs to keep them warm, they get, or protect them from the sun, they get crushed, and the eggs never hatch. And so as a result of all this use of DDT, pelicans essentially vanished entirely from Louisiana, were extremely rare in Texas. There were perhaps a few more in Florida, but the numbers were also on a very steep downward trajectory. And I've had experts tell me that they would have gone extinct if action hadn't been taken. Fortunately, action was taken, inspired by Rachel Carson, who in 1962 wrote the book Silent Spring about the dangers that pesticides posed to birds and other wildlife. And then in 1972, DDT was banned. Now, the pelicans were listed as endangered in 1970, just before that ban, but by 2009, they were taken off the endangered species list. And I saw plenty of pelicans when I was visiting in Florida, and they are now, again, a wonderful success story as a consequence of the action that people took.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Dr. Nancy Knowlton about environmental bright spots. If you have comments or questions, you can join our conversation on air at 904-549-2937. You can also go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us. So I want to come back to the idea that looking for bright spots, Nancy, doesn't mean ignoring reality. There are setbacks and all kinds of horrifying projections when it comes to climate and the planet. But you, in the examples you cite, you say that there's sort of four elements that the examples of success have in common. Certain things that may contribute to the success of an environmental movement on a smaller scale or on a larger scale. Can you run through some of those commonalities that some of these stories share?
Sure. Well, one of the first things that I've mentioned is the commonality of individuals really trying to make a difference. That's really important, and you can see it in the writing of Rachel Carson, or the women that led the movement against the use of feathers in people's hats. The second thing that's really important is government and finance, and you see that as well. Treaties and rules to protect species or habitats that needed protection, and in some cases, financial support has been really critical in making sure that these successes were enduring. The third thing that's important is science and technology. We're seeing that really strongly now in all sorts of different ways with wildlife. I haven't these have been sort of older examples that we've talked about up until now, but for example, the use of drones and tagging technologies has allowed us to see where animals are going and what they're doing in ways that allows us to protect them better. And artificial intelligence, although obviously it's a very complicated subject like any technology, has already being used to, for example, decipher calls that are made in recordings, or looking at videos to rapidly process data that would otherwise take people a long time to do. And then perhaps most strikingly for me in a way is the role of science and technology in the energy transformation that's taking place. So we're seeing dramatic declines in the price of renewable energy and in batteries, which has enabled the uptake of renewable energy at a pace that year after year the experts failed to predict. So every year people said, well, probably we'll have this much solar power or this many electric vehicles. And every year those estimates have been surpassed by the actual facts. And then finally, it's important to recognize the role of nature itself. It's not always the case that nature recovers, but often if you remove the things that are really causing the problem, then nature itself can recover, just as the pelicans did and the egrets did. And there are many other examples like that as well.
In fact, and they're not all bird stories that you talk about in your lecture and in the recovery world, but there is a story that nicely encapsulates a lot of those elements, and that's puffins, the recovery of puffins. You live in Maine. This is a Maine story. Tell us a little bit about Stephen Kress, who he is and what he did.
Well, Stephen Kress is an ornithologist who has worked on puffins for his entire career. Puffins, some of your viewers, I'm not sure everyone's had a chance to actually enjoy puffins, but they're the kind of quintessentially cute bird. Mm-hmm. But they were also at the brink of extinction because of really severe hunting for their eggs. And so in Maine, by 1902, there was only one pair of breeding puffins left. Now, much of the legislation that protected these other birds also applied to puffins, and they weren't hunted for quite a long time. But what Stephen Kress recognized was that despite the fact that they were now protected by hunting, they still weren't recovering. And it was his insight that led to the new techniques to help them recolonize Maine. And what he recognized was that sort of the way people, when they walk by a restaurant, if there's nobody in the restaurant, they think, oh, maybe it's not such a great restaurant, and they keep on going. Well, puffins and lots of seabirds have like to live in groups, and they see just a plain rock without any other puffins. In the case of puffins, they're reluctant to try to build a nest there because their sense is that there must be something wrong with the rock if there are no puffins. So what he did was he put little wooden puffin statues on the rocks, and he played puffin calls, and then he translocated some puffins from elsewhere to these islands in Maine. And it took a long time. It took really decades for the success to emerge. And that's another part of conservation success is really persistence. It's not like you can always expect things to happen immediately, but after quite a long time, his patience and the patience of other people working on this project paid off. And there are now something like 1,500 pairs of breeding puffins on the coast of Maine.
Compared to just the one when he started.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's really a scientific insight that he provided that was the key elements of success, and it's been used now not only in puffins but in seabirds around the world because it's a very common phenomenon, as it turns out.
Certainly, his leadership was essential to that, and a good example of how one person can really make a big difference on a population. Puffins, now that they've been reestablished, are a huge source of tourism in Maine. There are whole cadres of students that come to study every year and live in Maine sometimes. There's this economic engine that has followed because of the success and the interest in seeing puffins. And so there are stories where the financial component of preserving a species like this can be very beneficial to an area. I want to ask you about one particular story that took economics into the calculation from the outset, and that's this Indonesian rainforest. It's on the island of Borneo, and Dr. Kanari Webb went there as a younger person, and found a lot of deforestation. Can you tell us kind of what she learned from the beginning, how her perspective changed, and what the solution was that she sought?
Yes, I think this is an extraordinary story of success, and really the bottom line message is you really need to listen to the people who are interacting with nature if you want to resolve a problem in that setting. So she went to Indonesia, and she was very upset about deforestation and its effects on great apes there. But she didn't just walk around saying telling all the local people, you can't cut down trees, it's really bad for orangutans. She actually spent well over a year just listening. She calls it radical listening. And what she learned from this process was why people were cutting down trees. It turns out people weren't cutting down trees because they wanted to cut down trees per se. In fact, they didn't really want to cut down trees, but they're cutting down trees in order to pay the medical bills for their kids. It was their only way of keeping their kids healthy. And so what she did was she brought in doctors from various places to help with medical problems there. She also brought in experts to help develop alternative livelihoods that didn't involve cutting down trees. And the result has been a 70% decline in the deforestation rate, a 90% decline in the number of families that make their primary living from cutting down trees. And what is really striking is a 67% decline in infant mortality. So I think this is the lesson of this story is that, first of all, that you really need to engage people. People are part of nature, and if they feel that protecting nature will hurt them, usually any kind of conservation method that you try to execute will fail. But often there are enormous benefits to people for protecting nature. And if you tap into those benefits, you have what conservation scientists often call a win-win situation, where wildlife benefits, nature benefits, but people also benefit as well. And in fact, in many cases, we don't always count these benefits, but if we counted them, often people and nature thrive by having nature help to prosper.
The financial and medical component of that is so interesting. I mean, it's my understanding that she actually went sort of back to medical school herself to get some training to help implement some of these changes. But she had found that because medical care in that region required cash, it was sort of the one form of purchasing or trade that required actual money as opposed to something that could be bartered, that was driving this deforestation, the need to log to get actual cash. And one of the incentives that the effort involved was offering a community discount on healthcare if there was sort of a community pullback on logging, which I thought was really interesting. So the cost of healthcare, the providers would discount by 70% and also allow for some measure of trade or bartering in order to remove that incentive, that cash need.
Yeah, I mean, many of the stories of conservation success, I think, revolve around they often say the devil's in the details. Those details really matter, because if people are working together to protect nature, the result is so much more powerful than it is if you have simply a top-down directive. You can't do this, you can't do that. In fact, top-down directives without bottom-up support almost always in the end don't work.
We're talking about environmental bright spots with marine scientist Dr. Nancy Knowlton. If you have comments or questions, you can call us at 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways you can connect with us. We have an email from Bill. He says, another positive milestone in the recovery of the wood stork, listed as an endangered species in 1984 and is being removed from the list of endangered and threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The breeding population is greater than 12,000 nesting pairs annually. Wood storks are now a common wading bird. I want to ask you about that too. I don't know how familiar you are with the wood stork being removed from the endangered species list. There is some tension there. I believe that there's people who are celebrating that as a win, and certainly it has rebounded a lot. There are other people worried that that is happening too soon before the species recovery is at a place where it can safely be removed from that protective status. That sometimes is an issue. It's not unique to this particular bird.
No, it's not unique. And I will say that when I was in Florida just these couple weeks ago, I went to another wonderful Florida success story, which is the Sweetwater Wetlands Park outside of Gainesville, which actually is a constructed wetlands that was built to improve water quality, but it's also an incredible boon to wildlife, where I saw wood storks. This is why I mentioned it. And it was built because over initial opposition that which vanished when people realized that it's actually cheaper to have a wetlands than a water treatment facility. But in any case, going back to the wood storks and removal from endangered species list, really requires paying attention to the details and the motivations for why something is being removed. But there are some people within the conservation movement who sort of have a initially, suspicious and negative reaction to things being removed from the endangered species list. My personal feeling is that if the data justifies removing things from the endangered species list, that is a cause for enormous celebration and not concern. But you do have to pay attention to the details. I don't know enough about the details of the wood stork to really comment specifically. And of course, it's also the case, I think it's worth remembering that you can remove one of the problems that face a particular species and then have new problems emerge, which involves going back and redoing or doing new things to solve a new problem that's affecting either the species or the habitat. So there's no simple answer, but by and large, our goal should be getting things off the endangered species list because it means we're succeeding in conservation.
In terms of incremental change, one of the examples that you pointed to here in Florida was the seagrasses of Tampa Bay. They, like seagrasses throughout the state of Florida, including here in the St. Johns River, have been in decline over a long period due to all kinds of factors, often pollution related. But there has been a concerted effort in that Tampa Bay estuary to bring back those grasses. What have you learned about what that effort has done, what it's focused on, and why it's been experiencing some positive results?
Well, the Tampa Bay example is actually one that's very near and dear to my heart because when I was first, as I mentioned, when I first started doing this, I quickly became aware of the fact that my colleagues were unaware of any of the successes we'd had. And in particular, it was announced in 2016 that Tampa Bay seagrasses had returned to 1950s level, which is an enormous success. But when I brought this up to my colleagues, most of them had never even heard about it. In fact, I was giving a talk to a bunch of Gulf scientists about conservation success in generally. And because the meeting was in Tampa, I said, how many of you know about this amazing success here that's right outside your window? And 200 people were in the room and only 4 people raised their hands. I thought, oh my gosh, if scientists don't know about the successes, how can the general public possibly be aware of them? So in any case, it was a huge success. And then, and this sort of refers to what I was just saying before, sometimes new problems arise. So it was this enormous success was announced. And then the seagrasses started declining again due to additional problems with water quality. And so I became actually quite concerned that maybe this success was going to turn into a failure. But the people who have worked on this problem, in particular the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, really are an amazingly determined group of people that have tackled all sorts of different elements associated with the decline of the seagrasses, because dealing with pollution can be very complicated because there are many sources of nutrient pollution that are running into Tampa Bay and required an enormous effort and a fair amount of money to do it. And they just won't give up. And so I was really very pleased to learn when I went back to Florida a couple of weeks ago from grad students at the University of Florida that in fact things are now starting to turn around again and the seagrass beds are again on a track of recovery. But it does take persistence. And so I always think of the analogy of a home. So the earth is our home, but we also live in homes, houses or apartments. You can't just clean one week and say, okay, I've cleaned and I don't ever have to clean again. I mean, you have to keep cleaning because the actions of people keep making things dirty, if you will. Well, the same sort of idea with conservation. You never solve a problem, but you address the problem and you keep your eye on it. And you may have to do regular cleaning, if you will, to keep things in a good state. So I think Tampa Bay is a really good example of that.
We have an email from Andrew. He says, your guest says that the government and science are sources of environmental help, as in the case with DDT. But what does she now, when government oversight is being reduced and scientific research is less supported, what does she believe now? Obviously, that is a concern.
Yeah, it's a concern to me and a lot of people in the environmental world. I mean, it's no secret that the environment is not the top priority of the current federal administration, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot that can be done at state and local levels. And so I think the pendulum will swing back because, as I mentioned before, taking care of the environment is good for people. And when people recognize that, they tend to act accordingly. I mean, Florida is a really good example of a state that realizes that if its environment declines dramatically, it's going to lose money because people come to Florida to enjoy the beautiful environment. And so it's not, no individual state or national government or international treaty is perfect. There are always compromises, there are always setbacks, but by and large, I feel that we will return to a trajectory of caring for the planet because it's the only planet we have to live on, and we need a healthy planet in order to be healthy and happy and have a good life ourselves.
It does seem there's some opportunities even within the actions of this current administration in terms of this new focus on health, human health, and the MAHA movement, that there is perhaps some traction there to form connections with things that are concerns, pollutants of concern, for instance, forever chemicals, things that are pesticides, that there is some overlap there.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in taking your wins wherever you can get them, and actually the emphasis on the negative effects of pollutants are really important. There was a recent study that just came out that showed by looking at pilot whales, I believe, some kind of whales, looked at their blubber, and it showed that actually some declines in forever chemicals in the blubber as a consequence of banning those specific chemicals. That's a tiny step in what is a very, very big problem. But yes, absolutely. Wherever you can find common ground. Environmentalists often work very effectively with hunters, for example, because both hunters and
Oh, I think we lost you, Dr. Knowlton. Oh, you're back.
Whoops, there, good. Both hunters and non-hunters care about a healthy environment. And so a lot of funding actually for conservation comes from the hunting and fishing community.
I do want to end, as you ended your lecture, with a couple of powerful quotes, one from Voltaire and one is an African proverb. Can you just tell us a little bit about those and why they inspire you?
Well, the quote from Voltaire is, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And that is, of course, partly what I've been talking about, the fact that there are setbacks, there are compromises, but take the wins where you have them and try to build more, and don't destroy something that is making progress just because it doesn't make all the progress that you want. And the African proverb, which I also love, is, if you think you can't make a difference, you haven't spent the night with a mosquito. We often laugh that the mosquito is a state bird in Maine. I think there are plenty of mosquitoes in Florida as well. So you understand that lots of mosquitoes acting to inspire people to fix what's wrong and create something good is often the way that change happens. I mean, those women working on feathers and hats, they were the mosquitoes of their time, and there are many mosquitoes operating today to make the world a better place.
Well, Dr. Nancy Knowlton, thank you for inspiring us to be mosquitoes. We really appreciate your wisdom, and thanks for sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Up next, a nonprofit that helps Floridians recover from decay and devastation is coming to Jacksonville. We meet its leader after the break. statewide nonprofit is bringing its rebuild and rehab operations to the First Coast. Here to tell us what they do and who might qualify for help is the Chief Executive Officer of Rebuilding Together Greater Florida, Jose Garcia. Good morning, Jose. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So this group is founded in 2000. It was founded as Rebuilding Together Tampa Bay. What was the catalyst for starting it in Tampa Bay? Was there a storm? Was there something that happened at that time?
No, what happened is we are an affiliate network. And back in the day, in 2000, we were a sanctioned event for the Super Bowl. So in 2000, the Super Bowl was in Tampa, and the national office came down to Tampa and said, hey, would you like to do some projects, make an impact in the community, and see if you want to create the Rebuilding Together affiliate in Tampa? So that's how it was born. And then over 6 years, just the boards did few projects here and there until 2006, December 2006, when they interviewed me. And I was hired back then as an executive director. But I was a one-man show. I always said that I stole our first pen and notebook from my children. There was no desk, and everything happened in my car.
So you actually came here originally from Venezuela.
That's right.
How old were you when you arrived? You didn't come to Florida immediately.
No, I was 22 years old. Truly, back then, there was no need for any Venezuelan really to emigrate anywhere. I'm a son of an immigrant, so it's in my veins anyway. And we graduated from university. We're doing well, high middle class family, and everything was great. So, but I was very bored. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go to the United States and I'm going to learn the language and then come back to Venezuela and utilize all those skills. But 1 year turned into 2 and 5 and 30 something. I think this year is going to be my 38th anniversary here. And I was 22 years old. And I started in Baltimore. Then I moved to Washington, D.C., a nonprofit who I ended to be their executive director. Signed for my green card. And then from there, I did a lot of tenant organizing, housing in Washington until we moved to Tampa.
So you mentioned this is an affiliate. The Rebuilding Together National Network has more than 140 members or affiliates. And there's more than 40 counties now in Florida that are served by your organization. What is the current footprint? And tell us why Jacksonville is your next expansion site.
Well, first, we had an affiliate here in Jacksonville prior to the Tampa Bay affiliate. And, it's kind of recouping again the presence.
That was back in the early 2000s.
Early 2000. Yeah. Basically, we start to expand when storms and hurricanes started to impact severely in the state, in Southwest Coast, the Central West, and all those areas. And, it's just you start to grow, and then you start to understand that there are other needs. Then other municipalities and leaders call us and say, hey, can you do work here as well? And we move it slowly to where we are today. We have agreements with all these municipalities. We do residential repairs and rehab services. And some of them we do reconstruction, tear down the entire house and build it back. In other areas is we allocate funding from corporations and foundations, and at the minimum go once a year to make an impact in the community. So Highland County, DeSoto County, Hardy County, those are counties that we may go from time to time, not necessarily we have offices there, but we are committed to help the people. In the case of Jacksonville, we need to come, obviously we want to come to work with other nonprofits. Always saying that we don't want to be a threat. We want to work with those that need our help and services, and we want to establish an office here.
And so when that happens and you begin to do the rehab work or the rebuild work, Who qualifies for that assistance, and what kind of work will you provide for somebody, say, if they're in a home that is starting to deteriorate?
Yeah. That's a great question. Usually it's families in the 80% of the median income and below. Family of four shouldn't be making more than 60 something, $70,000 a year. The work is residential, basic residential repairs. It's limited. We start with the roof, making sure that there are no leaks, that it needs to be replaced. We go around the envelope of the house, windows and doors, and then we start to work inside, which usually is plumbing, electrical, and bathroom conversions. If homeowners sometimes say, can you also do the kitchen? Can you change my cabinets and all those things? And we don't do that. It's what they really need to have functioning in order for them to stay in the house, air conditioning systems, and safety and security.
You also do a lot of work with veterans, I understand, and some of that work can involve retrofitting an existing home if they're perhaps having an injury or something that they are recovering from. How do you interact with the community of veterans, and is that part of the reason that Jacksonville is in your sights now, just because of the large veteran community here?
Well, we are finding that our funders and corporations want to help if we help veterans. And so that's kind of the niche that we're finding right now in Jacksonville. We are going to be doing projects with the Home Depot and the Home Depot Foundation. We're actually planning one for May and then another one in November, and we just did back in November another project.
And is that a company that prioritizes working with veterans?
Home Depot does that. But they provide funding for other things, like in times of disaster, hurricanes, they are very supportive of our services as well. But they always want to help veterans. And
where does your funding come from?
Many places. So obviously local municipalities through the SHIP funding and community development block grant funding. We also have a lot of corporations and foundations, corporations especially. We engage them. They provide the funding. We do the work, and then their employees can come and do volunteer work. Usually it's exterior painting, landscaping, and just the final touches of the house once all construction is over.
Also state money?
Yes, that it will be the SHIP funding, but they usually comes through the local municipality.
Okay. And so you aren't yet set up here, but if people are interested in starting the application process, how do they begin that?
Well, they can go to our website, which is www.rtgfl.org, and they can apply for services. They can do it through the Tampa, Orlando. Right now, we're setting up the Jacksonville area button, so they can go straight and apply for that. Technology is very interesting, so IT says that we need to do this and that, so it's taking longer. But we already have several applications from the Jacksonville area. Very exciting, many of them veterans, by the way. So I think we are going to make a great progress, and we're going to show what we can do in the community. But we invite them to apply at all time.
All right. Jose Garcia, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invite.
All right. Up next, a community event celebrating women in the arts. We'll tell you how you can get involved in the 4th annual Women Arts Exchange.
Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com. Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com.
Film at WJCT presents a screening of the dark comedy If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. Academy Award nominee Rose Byrne plays a woman trying to manage her own life and career while on the verge of a nervous breakdown, who must cope with her daughter's illness and absent husband. a missing person, and an unusual relationship with her therapist. March 11th at WJCT Studios. Doors open at 6:30, film starts at 7. Go to wjct.org/film for tickets.
The U.S. economy added around 130,000 jobs in January, but nearly all of those jobs were in one industry, healthcare.
If you eliminated healthcare, we basically would be seeing no job growth at all in the private sector.
Why job numbers aren't rising outside of healthcare and what that means about the true state of the U.S. economy. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
An investigation reveals that the Justice Department withheld or removed some of the Epstein files related to allegations against President Trump of sexually abusing a minor. As many high-profile figures testify about their ties to Epstein, could the president be next? That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. A creative corridor forms in Jacksonville Beach this weekend for the 4th annual Women Arts Collective Festival. Here to tell us about a first-time collaboration with other groups is Emily Cargill. She's director of the contemporary performance group Emily Cargill and Dancers and the founder of the Women Arts Exchange. Emily, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're also joined by Jacksonville Beach Mayor Chris Hoffman, also the executive director of the Beaches Museum. Chris, nice to see you.
Good morning.
And Bradley Akers, managing director of Players by the Sea. Hey, Bradley.
Hey.
So, Emily, this is the 4th annual Women Arts Exchange, but it's the first time you're doing it with other partners. What made you want to bring in these other groups to participate?
Yeah, well, it's really exciting when you see artistic partnerships in the community. That's kind of the overarching platform of the Women Arts Exchange, you know, at the bare bones. So as I was kind of creating my ideal world for this year, Bradley and I did a performance last year. I was in his space. I've been to the Beaches Museum numerous times to see friends in their art shows, and it just kind of clicked. And I was like, these two organizations are just cornerstones of artistic excellence in, honestly, the city, not just the beaches, but the city of Jacksonville. So I honestly just sent out an email and said, hey, I have this idea. Do you want to be involved? This is what it is. And I mean, honestly, they were both like, sign me up. This sounds like an awesome experience.
There is a natural relationship there just in terms of proximity, Chris. For people who aren't familiar with the participating organizations, describe just that little area and how it all fits together.
Sure. I joke about the Beaches Museum. It's that big yellow building you've driven past a million times, but maybe have never been in. So we're always looking for opportunities to provide quality programming to really get people in the doors of the museum. But we have a 2-block history park as well. So we have historic buildings, and what a lot of people recognize us for is the locomotive out front. But we have this beautiful park, and then kind of at the other end of the park is our friends at Players by the Sea. So we're really trying to establish that as kind of an arts and culture corridor for Jacksonville Beach, and it's working out beautifully as we're going to see this weekend with the WAX events.
And Bradley, how are you participating in this weekend's events? What's going to be on offer there, and how are you sort of coordinating with the folks at the museum and with Emily?
Sure. So Players by the Sea is going to be home of the Move part of the festival, which is the contemporary dance performances, which is so exciting to see our space be activated in a way that our patrons and our community may not be used to. But we're also going to feature some monologues through the park in between the museum and the theater. So it's sort of like this blend of, as folks leave the museum, which is where the fine and visual arts are, they'll start to move through an immersive performance installation through this beautiful, beautiful history park, and they'll end at Players by the Sea. So it's been great. Chris and I have been trying to make sure we can establish this arts and culture corridor, and we keep saying, we need to make this happen, we need to make this happen. So this event being sort of the impetus of what's going, I think, to be a beautiful beginning to this new experience for everyone.
And Emily, you mentioned sort of the instinct that you've always had to bring together artists and collaborative efforts, but also a focus on women. It's Women's History Month. And so the visual artists are going to be women on display. That exhibit stays up, I think, for several weeks. But the dance component, the performance component is just this weekend.
Yes. Well, actually, at the museum is offering their home to 5 selected artists for the duration of March through a little bit of April. And then just for the Wax Weekend, there's about 20 local visual female artists on display just through the weekend. And then people travel through. And then the dance festival is just Friday, Saturday.
Okay. And so if people want to attend, we mentioned the location, but how do people participate in each different part of the offerings?
Well, if you go to waxandjacks.com, which is our website, you can look at the whole lineup, get tickets there, and your ticket cost covers all of the events. So you show your ticket at the door at the museum, which is where it begins at 6:30, kind of have a little bit of time there, travel through the history garden, and then just kind of mosey right to the Players by the Sea, and all costs are covered under your ticket price.
And then that performance is sort of 8 to 9:30 at the Players by the Sea area. Is that, or is it ongoing?
Yes.
Okay.
8 to 9:30. We have about 7 choreographers participating, both local artists and also companies from up and down the East Coast. So they're in town for one weekend only. So if you want to come see, truly world-class dance, this is where you got to be.
And Chris, how is Jacksonville Beach doing generally in terms of promoting its arts lineup and its offerings as a distinct identity?
Sure. I think we've seen a lot of progress in Jacksonville Beach. From the city-wise, we have so much more public art. We have murals and sculptures, and really leaning in on using our public spaces for, music and other performances. So we have a few organizations out at the beach that are actually part of the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville grant funding. So when we have the opportunity to partner together to help amplify that programming at the beach, it's just a great thing. So that's why it was such an easy yes when Emily came to us, because being out at the beach, we're, a little further afield for some people, but that when we can come together and put together really great programming, not only for our community, but for the region and for the county overall, it's a great thing. And it's going to be such a win this weekend for incredible art.
All right. And an opportunity for people to support Players by the Sea, which is still kind of moving back in after its fire. It's waxandjacks.com. Join us tomorrow when we talk to our media roundtable about the week's headlines. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. FPL, where teams work to inspect, upgrade, and strengthen the grid. FPL, working for you every single day. Details are available online at fpl.com.